Ere I saw a dappled wonder settling across the fields, hovering on angel wings, brandishing a blazing shield.
Where do they go? The ones that run away and never return.
There is nothing here but suffering. Pain and suffering. It is time to go.
The girl in that bulletin is wanted for the murder of a child.
Man lost my mom, then me. Ain't no way he ever given up on finding me.
There's anger in you. It'll fuel you, yes, but what's the worst kind of fuel? The worst kind.
Savagery a man is capable of when he believes his cause to be just.
The Underground Railroad, Barry Jenkins' epic adaptation of Colson Whitehead's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, features a sweeping orchestral score composed by Nicholas Britell. The composer previously earned Academy Award nominations for his work on Jenkins' films Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk. His credits also include the HBO series Succession, for which he won an Emmy for its theme music. The Underground Railroad is a 10-part Amazon Limited series that follows Cora Randall, played by Tuso Mbedu, as a slave who flees her Georgia plantation. In this episode of The Hollywood Reporter's Behind the Screen, we'll be talking with Britell about this score, as well as listening to some of his cues from the series. I'm Carolyn Giardina. Welcome to Behind the Screen. So Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us.
So happy to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with how you and Barry met each other.
Sure. It was 2015. I was working on The Big Short, actually, and one of the producers on The Big Short, Jeremy Kleiner, and I were having dinner, and I remember him. He was telling me about a screenplay that he was helping produce. And as he was talking about the screenplay, he started to get very emotional and actually cry a little bit. And he was, I was sort of like, what is the screenplay? And he sent it to me, and it was the screenplay for Moonlight. And I read it, and I thought it was the most beautiful script I'd ever read. I think to this day, it's still the most beautiful script I'd ever read. And, I said, is there any way I could just meet Barry or grab a coffee or, and so Jeremy said he would check and see if, Barry wanted to meet me. And we just got together for a coffee at the Ace Hotel in downtown LA. And what initially was supposed to be 30-minute coffee turned into a multi-hour conversation about music and movies and life. And we opened a bottle of wine, and that was really just the beginning of this conversation that I think we're still having to this day. In a way, it just it was pretty amazing.
Well, from Moonlight to If Beale Street Could Talk to Underground Railroad, what is it about your relationship that you think makes it work so well?
Well, I feel so lucky to work with Barry. He's one of the most incredible people I've ever known, and he's a truly remarkable collaborator. I think we both have a sense of the mystery of kind of all artistic work in a way. The beginnings of our work on any project are we both really cherish those moments, and there's a sense of the joy of experimentation. There's a sense of being excited that we don't know where we're going to wind up on things. We both really share that, and I think it's really an integral part of our process, actually. As we work on things, we feel we're learning as we go, and we're discovering things, and it's those kind of moments of discovery, I think, where there's a kind of shared joy in seeing what's possible and with finding something that you didn't expect. And it's incredibly inspiring to know that everything is possible in a sense. There's such an openness to trying things out that I find so inspiring. And just as an example, if we work so closely together, we're in the room together. That's really part of our process. And I'll sometimes say, I have a crazy idea, or I want to show him something, and he'll always say, "Show me." I'll just say, "Show me." There's never a notion of, well, actually, I don't think that's going to work. Let's not. It's always, let's see. Everything's a yes in a way, and then when it, oftentimes things don't work, and the great thing is that's also helpful to us. When something doesn't work, it shows you what could work. So in a lot of ways, not only is he so incredibly brilliant and insightful and has amazing instincts and loves music and, all of those attributes, but he's also, he and I share that kind of, I think, philosophy of the process. And that might be the thing that connects us the most in some of these ways. Just artistic process and artistic collaboration are such intangible kind of things in a way but I think there are certain attributes that really, that actually when you drill deep, that really matter. The process itself really matters. And I remember actually, it wasn't in our first conversation, but I remember it was a few months later. I remember meeting up with Barry in LA, and he hadn't worked with a composer before, and this was before we had really gotten deep into scoring Moonlight. And I remember him saying to me, how should this work? Like, what do we do next? Now that we've talked, and I remember saying to him, I think we just have to be in the same room, and we have to spend time together, and we have to see the same things, hear the same things together at the same time. And I still strongly believe that, which was one of the at times one of the real challenges over this pandemic, which also actually had an interesting outcome in a sense, because of the pandemic, my wife and I ended up moving to LA for 6 months, and because of that, we counterintuitively actually spent more time with Barry than we've ever spent before, because we were in this kind of quarantine pod together. But those were really the early conversations. It was, I think there was really a similar approach to the process, and yeah.
From the pandemic standpoint, where were you in planning the score with him when we had to stay at home, and how did you work together on it?
I had started working with Barry the previous year. So he had started filming in the summer of 2019. So we had already been talking before the pandemic and working together, and actually had, I think because I knew how large the scope was for the Underground Railroad. I mean, it's so massive, and I was aware of just the multidimensionality of it, the multiple worlds that were going to be required in a way. And so I remember having conversations with both Barry and with Joy McMillan.
Mm-hmm. Joy the editor,
incredible, brilliant editor and friend. And just saying, I kind of want to get ahead of the game a little bit, because I think there's so much that needs to be done. And so we started early on talking about things. There were actually times in October of that year, for example, and then in December, January, before the pandemic, where we would have whole sessions together. We'd spend days together thinking about things and trying things while he was shooting. But then when the pandemic happened, on the filming side, there were only a couple days left, I believe, of filming. So because so much of the series had been shot, we were able to start on post, which was essential to us being able to finish it, obviously. But early on, that was the big question I had was, how am I going to do this if I can't be in the same room with Barry? Like, how does this work? Because I really mean it when I say I think it's essential. It's not, so I was sort of like thinking, okay, let's try FaceTime or something like that. This was pre-Zoom. No one was using Zoom yet. So I remember we had these interesting sessions where I would kind of like set up a laptop with FaceTime and put it in like at the computer with this, and I would say, hey, can you hear this? Okay, let me email it. It was very difficult. It was not efficacious to our process. So it became apparent that we had to figure out a way to be together. And so we moved to LA for 6 months, and we got a house there that we rented. And Barry would, a typical day for Barry might be working in the edit in the morning, coming over to our place in the afternoon, sometimes all the way from 1 to 8 or 10 at night. Some days going to the mix stage. So it was really, in hindsight, it was really necessary for this, that we spent that much time. We spent more time working together on Underground Railroad than all the things we've done combined. And it was really the only way to finish the project, I think, was to spend that much time on it. Every episode, in a way, was like a movie in its scope. I mean, some of the episodes, I think episode 2, for example, South Carolina has almost twice as much score in it as Moonlight has. Just that one episode, So there was an acknowledgement of the scope of work that we knew we had to figure out a way to accomplish that. One of the key elements of the way that Barry and I work is really he has these initial instincts which are incredible, and on every project he has an initial first kind of idea that he wants to explore. On Moonlight, for example, he knew right from the beginning that he wanted a classical kind of orchestral score, but we also talked about the idea of using chopped and screwed techniques on the score. On Beale Street, early on, his first sense was he said he was hearing the sound of brass and horns. So just off that, I went and started experimenting with flugelhorns and cornets and French horns, and on Underground Railroad, the first thing that happened actually was on a very musical specific level. I remember he was on set in Savannah, and he sent me. I got an audio text message from him. And he doesn't usually send me audio text messages, but so I got this audio recording, and it just sounded like a construction site with no comment. And I was a little confused, wasn't sure what that meant. And a couple hours later, I got a text from Barry, and he just wrote, "Did you get what I sent?" And immediately I knew what he was talking about. He was talking about, there was the sound, the construction site, it was drilling into the ground. And so I immediately started thinking about, okay, he's talking about digging, he's talking about going downward. And I took the sound of the drilling and I started experimenting with it. I bent it. There was this, when you stretched it out, there was this kind of interesting rhythm that he was into. There was an undulating kind of tone to it. And that was really the starting point to this whole realm of experimenting that we did on kind of like elemental forces, I would say, in the beginning. It was so there was earth, there was digging into the earth, going downward, going underground. There was air. What's in the air? It's these cicadas. And Annalie, our incredible sound supervisor, would send me these, Annalie Blank, amazing artist, and she would send these field recordings she was making of cicadas. And I would take those, and Barry and I would experiment with them, and I would take those, and actually we found that there were these almost like interesting kind of melodies that you could hear if you slowed down the sound of the cicadas. And then fire, we took the sound of fire, another elemental force, and taking that sound of fire and actually, seeing could we weave that into the score somehow. So these were these kind of early stage experiments that we would do where, like I said, we never really know where we're going to wind up with things, but these are the sort of starting points. And interestingly, I think it was really the going downward, the drilling, the digging kind of a concept that actually led to me then saying musically, what musically could be the sound of kind of going downward? What is that? What is the nature of that? And I took this 4-note motif that I was thinking of, literally a musical chromatic descent, E flat, D, D flat, C. And I started playing with that as this idea of going down. And then it was in January 2020, I think it was early on, where I was with Barry. And I remember I can always tell when Barry's into something, because he'll, if I'm playing him something, he'll say, "Keep going, don't stop, don't stop." So I remember playing this piece for him, And I started putting these chords around this inner chromatic descent, and we called it pillars because it felt like these almost kind of like these pillars in the earth. And then that piece continued evolving over many months. You know, all of the musical ideas evolved over such a long period of time, where what started as this idea of kind of like drilling then went musically into the descent, then went into the piano, then I put strings with it, and then I experimented with this very raw kind of tremoloing string. And eventually we then recorded that remotely in London with a 50-piece string orchestra. And then I took those recordings and brought them back into the piece and experimented further. And that is the story basically of the piece you hear at the very beginning of the series. That piece is Genesis. So that's kind of, you know, one example. Yeah.
Nicholas, another cue that you selected was the journey, which is when Cora and Caesar are running across the field in the first episode. Would you talk about that one?
Sure. You know, like I was saying, I mean, I think the real challenge with Underground Railroad was to be able to capture and convey the scope of the journey and the scope of the different worlds that Cora was going into over the course of the series. And each of those worlds required a reimagining and a reinventing of the musical landscape. There was never one musical soundscape that would work for all the episodes. Really the opposite, actually. It was almost every episode has its own very distinct world. And yet within all of that being said, there were certain ideas that absolutely did have to connect as well, because there is clearly a connective thread in the series. And what was fascinating to me was figuring out with Barry, at what point in the series, at what point in the work do we start going back and sort of reapproaching what we've done with the knowledge of where we were going to go. So that was this kind of very large scale, almost like architectural kind of question. So the journey was one of those musical concepts which linked across the series. And the first incarnation of that musical idea is in the moment that you mentioned when they're running across the field. And that piece has a lot of different elements to it. There is a kind of opening musical exposition to it, which is really more atmospheric, I would say. There are certain sounds, there are certain rhythms, there are certain percussion elements that you hear, which will rhyme with later moments in the series. There's the sound of a harp, which will become integral later in the series. And then about midway through the piece, we hear a cello playing this bass line initially and then taking over a melody. And that is really what we would call Caesar's theme. And so you hear that theme. There are other places where the Caesar's theme connects in a lot of the series without giving too much away. But that idea became something which really was integral to the series. And without giving anything away too much, the journey idea comes back as actually the last piece in the whole series. And the last piece you hear is what we call the journey reprise. And that's the final iteration of that piece. So there's a connecting with that moment in episode 1 and actually with the final moment in the series.
In another episode, there's this scene where Cora is walking down Main Street in a yellow dress, and this cue was called Bessie. Would you like to describe it?
Bessie was a very important piece of music for us because I remember in reading the book, the South Carolina episode was particularly fascinating in that sense of there was a skyscraper in South Carolina in the mid-1800s. And I remember when I read that, at first I said to myself, I didn't realize there were skyscrapers in the mid-1800s in South Carolina. And then, of course, there were no skyscrapers in the mid-1800s in South Carolina. And that immediately brought up all these questions of the historical anachronisms, the magical realism that is central to the Underground Railroad, literally to its Underground Railroad as well. And it started this question and this conversation of what should that sound like musically? Like, what does that mean in a sense? Like, how do we convey that feeling of strangeness with music? And when we got to South Carolina, that was a big question that Barry and I had talked about before we even started experimenting with these ideas. But what we came to was this idea that there was an almost fantastically lush orchestral sound, which juxtaposed with Cora's journey in South Carolina. That juxtaposition felt like a question mark in a sense. And I think that's something which is really a part of our film music aesthetic, I guess you almost could say, that the idea that we never really want to push the audience to feel a particular way. That's not something that we try to do. We really try to, for us, evoke hopefully the actual feeling of something is kind of how we're trying to do it, almost being more inside of it in a sense. So we didn't want to say this is strange, perhaps, where by putting a strange sound, we actually wanted to put a piece that in combination with where you are and where she is, you're just sort of wondering why this piece is like, what does this piece mean? So that's what Bessie in a way represented to us. It was a lushness, a fantastical lushness, but also it raised an important question, I think, about the nature of Cora's journey and also the nature of the magical realism in the Underground Railroad.
You talked a little bit about recording the music under the pandemic. Were you able to go over for that, or were you listening remotely? How did that work?
So it was I've never done this before. I've always been at my recording sessions and I've always conducted the orchestras too. I love that part of the process. Actually, in a way, it's very psychologically cathartic when you write all this music to actually go and record it. It's sort of it gives you a sense of, kind of a sense of closure, of a process. And when you can't do that, it's actually pretty difficult because you don't get this feeling of the joy of being there. That being said, it was remarkable what we were able to do remotely. I was not able to go to London during that period of time. And so what we did was, there's an amazing, extraordinary group of musicians who I've worked with in London over the years, and we recorded at Air Studios in Lyndhurst Hall, the huge, beautiful church hall there. And there's basically this incredible technology. There's a program called Audio Movers that you use. You basically set up Zooms, so you have cameras where you can see everything happening. And then you have a program that you use that plugs directly into the mixing board in the studio. So I was in Los Angeles, at like 5 a.m. LA time. And in London, this magnificent group of musicians is recording, and I can actually hear in virtually real time and with total high definition what the mixing booth is hearing at the studio. So I was amazed by that. I had never done that before. And when I say it worked, I mean, it really works. Like, you actually hear what's happening as if you were there. So while you physically don't get the pleasure of being in the room, you do sonically get to be able to have total control over the sound and what you're looking for. So that was how we were able to do it. And we recorded with an orchestra for basically a week. There were also many other recordings I did. We can talk about that with, for example, with Julia Bullock and David Huey, these incredible singers. Julia was in Norway at the time in a cabin quarantining, I believe, when she recorded her vocals. And, and then there were other remote, over the 18 to 20 months, there were other remote sessions that we would do in different parts of the world. But for the big orchestra sessions, that's how we did those.
Well, let's talk about what you just touched on. One of the cues that has Julia Bullock's vocals is titled Aria. Would you like to describe that one?
Barry and I have never actually worked with vocalists on our projects. And it was, again, like all the ideas that Barry has that we talk about, it started out initially as an experiment. We weren't sure what the nature of voice would be, but Barry had an instinct that there could be something really beautiful and powerful about incorporating it into the score, literally, and early on, there was a piece that I wrote that was going to be in a couple different places. We were going to potentially hear it in the beginning in South Carolina, but it actually would become much more integral in North Carolina. And the thing, again, one of the things I love about working with Barry is, he has the entire scope of the series in his mind's eye and ear to such a remarkable extent that, I could play him a piece and he would just say, North Carolina. And I'd say, episode 10, and he would say, not a lot of music. He would just know. And obviously as a composer, that's an incredible gift to work with someone who has that vision for the project at hand. But with the vocalists, I wrote this piece initially for harps, actually. And then there was a very particular moment in episode 2, where in South Carolina, where there's kind of a transitional moment where I think the episode is beginning to take a turn, is what I would say, without giving anything away. You're starting to change the tone of where we are, and in a sense, deepen and take us to a darker place, in a sense, where you realize that things are not what they seem. And at that moment, Barry and I talked about putting this particular piece, but with a vocalist and an almost operatic vocalist. So I've actually I've been collaborating with the San Francisco Symphony. There's a kind of collective that Esa-Pekka Salonen has put together over the past few years, a collective of different artists. And one of the people is an amazing soprano named Julia Bullock. And so I reached out to Julia, actually, thinking that this might be a perfect collaboration. We'd never actually even met in person, but we have, I was such a fan of her work. And it turned out that she was in Norway at the time when I called her. And I sent her the music, and she recorded it, just in this cabin in the woods in Norway, and sent it over. And then as soon as I showed this to Barry and mixed it together, he got even more excited about the possibilities of voice. And so we went even further in that. And in parallel, I started working with David Huey, another incredible singer, a tenor, who also performed the same piece in a different way that would appear in the series, but also doing a lot of vocal experiments where actually, for example, asking David to even perform certain melodies of some of the themes and see kind of what those brought. And Barry was incredibly into this. So we just continued on with it, and we ended up having voice in certain parts of the series, which again, for us, was the first time we'd ever done that.
So, Nicholas, you've been very busy. Another recent project was Cruella.
Yes.
Would you tell us just a little bit about your approach to that project?
Sure. Cruella was very different, and I think for me, I'm always interested in trying new things and learning new things from projects. And I think for me, again, one of the things that excites me the most is the fact that I view all these projects as new adventures in a way. I never want to do the same sound twice. For every single project, I want to try to figure out something new, because it's just so fascinating to get to do this and to explore these new worlds. So Cruella was definitely something I'd never done that type of thing before. Working with Craig Gillespie, the director, and early on there was this huge range of huge rock tracks from the 60s and 70s right. That he wanted to have in the film. And so I think the challenge for the score was to do two things. It was really to create and to really embrace the full scope of Cruella as a character, as a person, with a full emotional scope. There's some very key moments in the film where Emma Stone, who's incredible as Cruella, where she is having these very powerful emotional realizations about herself and her mother and her family's history, without giving anything away. And basically, there were some moments that knew we needed this very large orchestral kind of scope. But at the same time, the key to the score itself was, how do you create a score that can connect with some of the largest rock tracks of the 20th century in a way, and make it cohesive. So my early conversations with Craig were just this pitch of, well, what if I recorded with amazing rock musicians in London at Abbey Road, and we had all the authentic gear from the 60s and 70s, and we somehow created a score that essentially was a rock score, and then also could somehow incorporate orchestra. So, it sounds like it checks the boxes on paper, but then you're sort of like, well, how do we actually do that? And he was really into this idea. So I started experimenting with that, and I did record with these amazing rock musicians in London, and recorded at Abbey Road and at Ayr as well, and then had orchestra fusing with these rock tracks. So that was really the idea of just making sure that when you were watching the film, that it didn't feel like there were these sort of apples and oranges where you'd have like rock songs and then all of a sudden you'd have a score that didn't relate in some way. The hope was that it would feel cohesive.
Who were some of the musicians that you worked with?
The musicians, I've actually worked with some incredible rock musicians who I've worked with on other projects as well. There's an amazing guitarist named Leo Abrahams, amazing bassist named Steve Pierce, Ian Thomas, our drummer. We also worked with a group of singers. There's some amazing vocalists on some of my score tracks. So I worked with members of the Swingle Singers, for example, who have that very distinctive sound from that era. So it's a wide range of amazing musicians, then also an orchestra in London as well. So yeah, it was fantastic.
And then another very different project. Correct, you're working on a score for Carmen right now.
Yes, that's still in process. I've actually been talking to Benjamin Millepied about that for many, many years, and he's been shooting that actually in Australia. Yeah, so it's a reimagining of Carmen, a total kind of reconception of what that project is.
To go back to Underground Railroad, at what point did you read the book, and would you just talk about? I mean, it's such a powerful story emotionally. What inspired your choices?
I read the book before, reading any scripts or before talking to Barry, actually, about his thoughts. And I think a lot of the musical themes that we've talked about were really some of those early thoughts that I had from the book. I think the biggest, obviously the scope and the power of the book are incredibly powerful and sort of unavoidable when you engage with that book. But I also think that those questions for me of the anachronisms and the strangeness and the magical realism, those were really some of the things I think right away when I read the book, those were my, I was already kind of honing in on the musical challenges, because I think that's just something that sort of, right away on any project, I'm already kind of thinking, well, what exactly, how is that going to feel? Or, I remember back to Moonlight when I first worked with Barry. It was that same kind of thing where I think it's really being sensitive to your earliest feelings about a particular project that I think is so essential to what you eventually create, because you only get to have a first experience of an idea once. It happens just once. So it's, the first reading of a book, the first time you read the script, I always will take a lot of notes and really think through exactly what my first thoughts and my feelings, because you don't get to do that again. Everything else is always in relation to that first moment. So, I remember on Moonlight, the same sort of thing where I immediately thought, my first instinct with Moonlight was that it was a poem. It felt like a work of poetry. It was so beautiful. And so I remember thinking to myself, that feeling of, what's the musical analog of that kind of a feeling of poetry? And that was that early kernel of an idea. And on Underground Railroad, I think it was the combination of the scope of it and that question of the magical realism. Those were the two things that I started thinking about. And then what was so fascinating was I never would have ever anticipated that Barry's first conversations with me would be about, the sound of drilling at a construction site, or, and that we would wind up taking cicadas and bending the sound and finding, so that's the joy of the process, is that you just never know where you're going to wind up.
Well, with this project, the sounds, the cicadas, this was actually something I wanted to ask you about, was so much a part of the project as well. Would you talk about just how you worked with the sound team and how you balanced the music and the sound really throughout the whole series?
Sure. I love working with Annalie, and what's great is I think there's sort of 2 points in the process where we talk a lot. There's the early stages when, I might be sitting with Barry and he'll say, I think Annalie has an amazing cicada sounds, so I'll say, hey, can you send me a Dropbox of cicada sounds, and then there's the later stages, and Annalie and I are so in touch because, especially, I would say more so even on TV than on film, there's the ending schedule cycle of creating a television series. There is so much that goes into that on a weekly basis. Film in some ways is so much more self-contained, where usually there's a period where the dub happens and it's this, whereas on television, it's this massive scope that every week has a slightly different schedule, and you're sort of always trying to make sure you have everything that you need at the right moments. So Annalie was both an incredible, she's an incredible artist, but also it's great having a direct communication line with her, because I think there are technical things, making sure that she's getting from me what she needs. Some of the tracks, had so many stems, and Barry and I were doing so much experimentation in some of these pieces that, there were times where I was like, I know the bass is massive on this track, but, do your best, because there's this, Barry and I have this massive subwoofer in the studio there. So it's really a constant kind of conversation. And then on a creative sort of artistic level, I think that different episodes had different relationships between sound and music. Like I was saying, for example, episode 10, I remember early on Barry saying that he wanted it to be pretty sparse musically, and that sound would kind of take over in a way. Sound would be the lead. And there were lots of times throughout the series where that kind of a conversation would happen, where, even down on a micro level to a particular moment where, I would say, do we want music here? Or here's the type of thing we might do. And then him saying, you know what, sound's going to take that.
Well, we're going to wrap with one last cue from the series. And you had selected Penny Candies as one of your favorites. Would you introduce that one?
Penny Candies, again, this is in South Carolina. And this is a particular moment where Cora is, without giving anything away, again, I will say she's discovering certain things. She's piecing certain things together about what may very well be going on in South Carolina. And this music, this was, again, for me, kind of a transitional, there were a lot of these kind of transitional moments, tonally in a way, where we're feeling, there's a sense of wonder, but there's also a sense of something very, very difficult and horrific lurking beneath the surface. And that was a real challenge, I think, was how do you create music that does both of those things at the same time, that sort of implies one thing on the surface, but then is also saying something very, very different underneath. So Penny Candies is for me, I think, an example of that kind of balancing.
And Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to talk to you.